Great. Well, it's wonderful to see you all, and I cherish the chance to be back with Ward 4. I am very, very proud that this ward and this ward committee has been central to my understanding of city government, of politics, of community in Boston, and that I get to count myself as a part of this distinguished line of ward committee chairs, from Jonathan all the way back through Andrea and Kim and Janet, all the way back to Herb Hirschfang. So that has been just such a meaningful part of my political involvement in the city, and really what rooted me in Boston. And so I think folks who have known me since then, since I was in the South End and involved actively with the Ward 4 Democrats and helping with our very, very first ice cream socials, know that it wasn't a predictable path for me to politics. That as a daughter of immigrants, as someone who has lived through very challenging family experiences with my mom, continuing to struggle with mental illness, but myself having, at the age of 23, become my mom's caregiver and raised my sisters, who have now graduated from Boston schools and are out and about in the world, that my path to politics and city council really came about because my family has lived through government when it works and government when it doesn't work, and understanding just how big the disconnects can be, especially when you most need help. So my focus in government, in politics, has always been, how do we close these gaps? How do we coordinate the incredible resources that Boston has to truly connect to people's day-to-day lives and the needs that our communities who have been left behind for too long have been experiencing? This has become front and center during the pandemic, where we've seen just how big the gaps are and just how deep the injustices run when the same communities, Black and brown communities in Boston, immigrant communities, low-income families, the same communities bearing the burden of this pandemic, from the public health side to the economic side, with jobs lost and excluded from meaningful relief, are the same communities who already were facing gaps and crises long before COVID-19. And so whether it is strengthening our Boston Public Schools infrastructure, or ensuring access to transportation that is reliable, accessible, and affordable, to an economy that closes the racial wealth gap in Boston and truly works for everyone, we need leadership steering us into this next phase of Boston's history that truly is about urgency connected with community. I am a mom, and that drives me to go as fast as I could possibly go on all of these issues that need our attention. You all remember I was living in the South End when I first was elected to the council, and when my older son Blaze was born. I remember because he was in his little toddler snowsuit, and that was the winter of the huge snowstorms, and the snow was piled up on all the cars, and he couldn't go outside for a long time. He didn't know what sunlight was because it was in the middle of all that. But from then to now, just 2 mayoral terms later, Blaze has gone from being a baby, barely opening his eyes, to almost in first grade. 2 more mayoral terms, and Blaze will be in high school, right? That is the pace and the urgency that our families feel. We can't wait. We don't have the luxury of sitting back and waiting until everything is convenient and comfortable. From our schools to climate change, to our housing crisis, to closing the racial wealth gap, we have to act now, and we have the resources to do it. We have the activism, we have the ideas. We need that bold, urgent leadership. And I'm very excited to be laying out over the course of this next year just what a difference city government makes. We've seen it on the city council, where I have a track record of leading the charge in coalition, in partnership with community, to put forward major changes that have put Boston in the national spotlight for what it means when cities take action on paid parental leave and workers' protections, on ensuring language and communications access for all of our residents, on upping the sourcing of renewable energy, right? You all have gotten the letters now about community choice energy and this increase in our green energy, an order that I was proud to file in the council nearly 4 years ago and shepherd through. And so we have made changes, but only because we have opened the doors of the city council to partnering with community. That's what we need from the mayor's office too. Political will radiating out from City Hall to bring people into the conversation, not just to change the policies and the direction of our city, but to change who is at the table and the role that each one of us should have in shaping our future. So I'm eager to bring that urgency of a mom to every gap that we need to close and to make tangible change in a city where we know what we need to do. The reason we have been talking about the issues again and again, and yet not seeing tremendous change, is because Boston has had a siloed approach for far too long. Our communities are often separated and siloed and segregated from each other. And the way that we address issues in different departments is very siloed and separate and doesn't bring the full brunt of Boston's resources to our challenges. And so as someone who has lived and understands the importance of government, we need to not just recognize the intersectionality of our identities and our communities, but of our issues as well. We have what it takes, and I'm eager to ask for your support in doing this, to humbly ask for your vote at election time, and more importantly, to ask for your partnership in building this vision that we will be able to implement with the civic engagement, with the partnership in office.
Very nice.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us, and we're happy to take questions. So if you have questions, feel free to, you can drop them into the chat, or you can raise your hand, whichever one is useful, or you can just unmute and ask them. Anybody looking to ask a question? I can feed questions in my.
Happy birthday, which was her birthday was last week. Happy birthday, Michelle. This is Andrea.
Thank you.
Okay.
36 years old now, so I'm officially past young adult stage.
Oh. Well, happy birthday.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your Free the Tea plan? It's a part of your agenda that's like particularly exciting to me, and would love you to go more in depth about it.
Yeah. Hi, Harper. It's exciting to see you. One of the biggest differences when I was priced out of the South End and moved to Roslindale is around the centrality of transportation, right? It's one thing when you all are in a neighborhood where you can kind of get to where you need to go. There's bus lines and close proximity to walkable neighborhood. In Roslindale, every decision of how to get to City Hall, to other parts of the city, requires a mental calculation and strain and cost. And we know the data bears out that if you look at every factor that is linked to economic mobility and a family's ability to rise out of poverty, it turns out that the most closely correlated factor actually is not about school test scores in the area or public safety statistics. The most closely linked factor to economic mobility is the average commute time to work from where you live. And so transportation is fundamental. It is about every goal that we have set out: closing the racial wealth gap, connecting people to the opportunity in Boston, recovering from this pandemic, reaching our climate goals, and getting people out of fossil fuel powered cars onto public transportation, solving our congestion crisis, which, make no mistake, will be back as soon as our economy is recovering, especially given what Kabul was just talking about with the changes that have been slowed at the state level. We need to recognize that public transportation is a public good. Everyone benefits when more people are able to ride the T, not just those folks getting to work on the trains and buses, but drivers who don't have a choice but to drive, but can now move down the, along the roads faster. And so, as with other public goods, Boston should step up, stay true to our legacy of a city of changing history when it comes to investing in our common good, in our common wealth. We have the first public school in the country right here in Boston, first public library, first public park in the country, all because we realized that investing in removing financial barriers to open access for all benefits everyone. And so similarly, that needs to be the goal and the standard when it comes to what we're aiming for public transportation, free and accessible to all. How do we get there? The first immediate step is buses. This is a place where we know is financially feasible, right? Bus revenues actually make up only about 20% of the T's overall revenue budget, but we also spend a whole lot of money collecting fares on bus, more so than other services. And so one is ensuring that we are prioritizing equity. Bus is also where we see the greatest gaps in terms of our system, 64 hours more per year that Black bus riders spend on buses compared to their white counterparts, even though everybody rides the bus kind of equally across the board. But it's our bus system that tends to see bus riders in communities of color on longer routes with more transfers, with more delays. And so moving away from collecting fares on those buses also means faster and more reliable service. You're not having people dig their pocket, purses out of their bags or gather around the driver and tap the cards to get on the bus. In the early part of the pandemic, the MBTA actually took this step and made buses fare free because it was safest for the drivers, avoided people having to cluster all together near the front of the bus. It sped up service so people could space farther apart and sit with more space because the next bus was much more, was likely to come much more quickly. And so we know it's important for all of these factors. One of our local advocacy organizations, Livable Streets, has calculated tremendous cost savings, even from shaving just 30 seconds off of boarding time because we are no longer slowing people down and getting on the bus, is millions of dollars in operational costs saved because the buses can hit their routes faster, use less fuel, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we pay for it? It is about $30 million a year, which in the scheme of the state budget is pennies, literally pennies. 2 cents per gallon on the gas tax increase would pay for free bus service across the entire state. 1 cent, which results in about $30 million for MBTA buses, and then 1 cent, which is very important to take care of all of the bus agents, what are called RTAs, regional transit authorities across the state. This is a statewide issue of transit justice. We've seen that it works right here in Massachusetts when the city of Lawrence implemented fare-free transportation on their bus system. They saw ridership go up by double digits almost immediately, and it's transformed people's lives. So this is a step that we need to pursue with the state, starting with bus service, stopping the billion-dollar contract that we're about to spend in collecting fares and increasing the technology with what's called AFC 2.0, the automated fare collection system, which would actually make it harder for residents of color and low-income residents to use our bus system. And then short of that, in the very, very short run, using the city of Boston's leverage as a partner with the MBTA and our own budget to pick the bus routes where we should pilot this, just like happened with the mayor of Lawrence and their bus system. The 28 bus is where we should start. This is the route that runs from Mattapan Square through Grove Hall, through Nubian Square, to Ruggles, right near Longwood Medical Area, one of the fastest job centers growing anywhere in the country. So we can make this economic corridor connected along so many of our social and environmental justice communities to one of the places where our healthcare sector is growing and in need of talent. This is how we start to hit all of those goals at once, closing the racial wealth gap, hitting our climate goals, and ensuring sustainability for everyone.
Michelle, there's a question from Kim in the chat asking about staying on, and I see a question from Jackie that I'll get to in a sec. So Kim's asking, staying on the transportation theme, what are your thoughts on making the potential of the Indigo line a reality?
Yeah, I mean, it's, we should have a conversation about organizing for 2022 as well. I think there are, 2021 is going to be a transformational year for Boston, and the decisions that we make with our city at a crossroads right now will ripple for generations. we need to make sure that it also rolls right into organizing into 2022 and the statewide elections, because the frustrations that that I most often see are a city that is most directly impacted by our transportation system, our population, our economic issues, our racial justice issues, and yet the structure of state government makes it difficult in terms of the funding decisions and the allocating the resources to focus on Boston, even though, you know, my view, maybe a little biased, but I think also objectively, is that it returns, you know, the investment comes back in multiples when we invest in Boston transportation system for everyone across the state. So all of these infrastructure projects, I think, are tricky and complicated. It very much will depend on how this new federal administration is able to move. We have strong champions for transit and expansion of transit, particularly from an equity lens, in our federal delegation. I was proud to work with our Congresswoman, Ayanna Pressley, as she put together her Freedom to Move Act, which would, in partnership with Senator Markey, would create billions of dollars for subsidizing fare-free transit, as well as expanding service when it comes to equity and service expansions like this. So we need more help on the infrastructure expansion side and converting some of the lines that we have sort of been planning for and hoping for a long time. But if there's a window to do it, it is now, with the beauty and incredible victory of organizing in the Georgia Senate races and our new president and vice president as of tomorrow. This is a moment for Boston to get our asks in there and make sure that we are in the queue for when funding becomes available.
And I saw Jackie had a question.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Jackie. Oh, so wonderful to see you. You look healthy and well.
I wanted to know what your thoughts are about the current thoughts are about wetlands protection and how that meets also environmental justice concerns. What are your thoughts about putting those two ideas together?
Yeah, I'm very proud that we finally got the wetlands ordinance passed last December. This was a multi-year effort. And, you know, thanks to a huge coalition across the city of climate activists, environmental justice activists, we kind of muscled that across the finish line at our very last meeting of the year in, or actually now 2 Decembers ago, in December of 2019. And what we knew was that it was going to take a period of time for the city to promulgate the official regulations that accompanied that. So the shape of the ordinance generally is that in most instances, state law regulates requirements around building code and what the standards are. But state law explicitly leaves a window for municipalities to get involved when there are wetlands or natural resource areas concerned. And so Boston had been one of only 3 coastal cities in Massachusetts not to have taken this opportunity. And so we finally got this through. It empowers the Conservation Commission to make decisions requiring green and resilient development and shift some of the power away from the BPDA to our Conservation Commission. But they need to promulgate these regulations. I get at the specifics. The estimate was that it would take about a year, 18 months for that to happen. We're not quite there yet, which is just a tragedy in terms of the impact that we are already seeing sort of slip through the cracks. The East Boston substation is one example where, had the full force of the wetlands ordinance been in effect when they filed, that project to locate an electrical substation in a floodplain, in a residential area, in an environmental justice community in East Boston would have been blocked, right? That would have been off the table. But because we were slower to pass this in the first place, it's gotten the chance to slip through. And so this was possibly the biggest step we could have taken as a city to require green infrastructure and development. The other big step that needs to go hand in hand with that is around zoning and planning for our city to think not just building by building, parcel by parcel, but how do all of the impacts fit together of our housing that we need, with the transportation infrastructure to support that, with the climate resiliency that will make these buildings livable, with the schools that need to be in the area, the food access and food systems. And so I'm really excited about the chance to truly plan for our city's future in a way that integrates, again, breaking down our silos, connecting our communities, and directing our resources to the needs that we see in our communities.
Thank you.
Since I know that you do have a place to go, I'm going to note the 2 questions in the chat and the question that I have for you to answer one after the other,
Sure.
saving the time of the back and forth. So I see questions in the chat, questions from Lisa about whether you're open to moving toward an elected school committee. I see a question from Carol about what the impacts of having a special election in the mayoral race would be if the vacancy occurs before March 5th. And the question I would ask is about opportunities. So when it comes to police brutality, one of the best ways to reduce police brutality is to limit police interactions with people in the first place. And so ways that Boston could kind of change its way of thinking about public safety to limit the different areas that the police are in charge of in terms of like social responses.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'll do a quick spin through all 3 of these really important topics. So on the school committee, I support a hybrid committee, which would have more elected seats than appointed seats, but have some of both. For me, it's important to see accountability for the administration, as well as the ability to require or sort of add seats that have balance to ensure racial and ethnic and geographic diversity among the school committee board. But I think that this conversation is one that would require multiple steps over the course of many years and many more open public processes about it. You know, that's sort of my position going into this through this in the campaign. What I would say in addition to that is that ask mayoral candidates about the ability to implement changes immediately as well. So as we are pursuing that move to a shift to add elected seats to the committee, the mayor should commit, you know, as I am eager to, that the appointed seats now should reflect democratic accountability as well. That there could be 1 seat designated for whoever's elected through the citywide parent council, 1 seat for the a grouping of teachers to, whether it's through the BTU or another entity, to elect a member to the school committee to be appointed through that election process. The student member should have a vote. Our alumni and other stakeholders should have direct say and democratic voices in how we administer our school committee in the very, very short run as well, again, as we're making these larger structural changes. Harper's question about the special election, you know, I think in general, it is important for the city to have a democratically elected mayor, and the provision in the charter for, you know, having a special election if you're a certain distance away from the election means that there will be a shorter period of time with someone who is empowered to act, making important decisions about schools, about development, about all of these things, as opposed to having a longer period with an acting mayor who's in more of a caretaker position. In this year, the pandemic should take precedence, should be more important than any other consideration. And the idea that we are so close to that cutoff date, which is March 5th, and we are in the middle of vaccine distribution, and there are tremendous costs of administering an election safely in these conditions, to me, suggests that we should cancel that special election. You know, should it even be a point, which and may end up being moot, who knows, but we should just aim for that 1 election in September and November. And then to Jonathan's question about public safety and how we are structurally thinking about changing the department, this is the reason why I put forward, along with my colleagues Lydia Edwards and Julia Mejia, a proposal to start with how we're responding to 911 crisis calls. That right now, you know, in some districts in the city, in some police districts in the city, 80% of the calls, a huge number, are related to things that, in fact, it's not the most efficient, effective, or safe sometimes for an armed officer to respond to. Mental health crises, substance use situations, social work situation, residents experiencing homelessness. And so we should follow the lead of other cities who have created a separate community safety force that is a trained professional force, unarmed, that is separate from law enforcement, to be the first responder to so many of the calls that we currently are sending BPD to. And then in terms of the big picture, you know, when we talk about our criminal justice system, our so-called criminal justice system, usually we are talking about poverty, right? And so the question for the city of Boston is, as we are planning on our budget, as we are thinking about how we structure and fund public safety relative to public health, making the investments upstream, making the investments in stabilizing communities, creating opportunity, supporting our youth, and making sure that there are youth development programs and an integrated approach to how we are supporting our students, not just as learners in school buildings for some of the day, but as the chance to come into our schools as community hubs with wraparound supports and trusting adult relationships that follow them throughout their time in BPS. There's a lot that we can invest in that will directly reduce the need for police accountability, because we're reducing the need for a law enforcement approach, because we are reducing poverty.
Awesome, thank you. I know you told me before that you do have another event to go. We do have another speaker, but I have 2 questions in the chat. Either you can answer them now, or I can send them to you to answer later if you have to go.
I have a 7:30. I think I want to
If
just
I send these 2 questions to you now, can I get you to
Yes.
send the answers later tonight?
Absolutely. That would be great.
Okay.
And if you could send it to everyone too, just because, you know, of course, send it to the askers, but
I would send it out in a follow-up email to the committee, but I'll shoot you an email. There are 2 good questions. One about reconciling with Boston's history on race, and one about the socioeconomic impacts of COVID long-term. But thank you so much again for joining us, and can we have a round of applause?
Great to see you all. Oh, and a huge shout out to Vicky from my team, who is our organizer on so many things across the city, and just in charge of making sure that everything is connected to community. And so Vicky, of course, knows ward committees very well, but she'll, you know, if we can get your help in some way, if you have other questions, please reach out, and Vicky will make sure that we're following up and staying connected.
Awesome. And Vicky, if you can drop in your chat info for if people want to get involved with the campaign, that would be great. Awesome, and thank you so much.
Have a good night, everyone.
And then welcome. We also have Alex Gray, who's running for City Council at large here. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you, John. I appreciate it.
Awesome. If you want, you can just talk for a few minutes about your pitch, and then we can do some Q&A.
Perfect. Well, thank you again, John, and I hope everybody's holding up. I know this is a really hard time. I hope everybody's families are staying safe and healthy as best as possible. And again, thank you to Ward 4 for all that you guys do over the course of the year. I mean, I see, you know, Jonathan posting on Twitter and Facebook. I think you guys are phone banking 8 days a week somehow. So, you know, you guys were a big hand in what will happen tomorrow with the swearing in and what went on in Georgia. So thank you for that. And as John said, my name is Alex Gray. I'm running to be one of your 4 at-large city councilors. I live in Jamaica Plain with my wife, Lauren. And, you know, for me, I have had the fortune in my career to work in every neighborhood in the city and to take the time to listen to people throughout the city. And I've really found that everybody has the ability to make a difference in the city. But I think so often the ability to make that difference comes down to access. You know, access, there's 2 parts to access, right? Access can be a physical thing, but it's also a mindset or an attitude. And, you know, I think for me, you know, I went blind when I was about 10 years old, and I was, you know, quickly given a lot of physical technology, a white cane, a braille writer, things like that, that allowed me to sort of acclimate myself into the world without sight. You know, in my career, I have seen when I started working in housing and homelessness, you know, so often we get caught up in the physical side of it, which is an actual home for somebody to live in. And, you know, in my career, I've seen that time and time again. I worked for Governor Patrick on the Fairmount line, and we talked a lot about, you know, physical train. And, you know, I worked for Mayor Walsh to launch the tuition-free community college plan. And that was all about waiving tuition and mandatory fees. But, you know, sometimes, you know, the physical part of accessibility isn't enough. You know, you need an attitude change. And, you know, I personally saw that very early in my life. You know, I left elementary school and I entered middle school, and you know, immediately there was a pushback from teachers that didn't know me. You know, was it appropriate for a blind student to be in a traditional classroom? You know, can this teacher aide stay in the classroom with the student? So on and so forth. And you know, for me, you know, my parents, they listened to me, they knew me, and they fought for me, and it really changed my life. So, and I've seen that in my career. You know, with housing and homelessness, for me, you know, we talk about the house, we talk about the apartment, but I think really when we started to make change on housing and homelessness, it came down to a sense of wraparound services. How do we think about the person holistically? You know, we're thinking about, are we providing mental health services? Are we providing addiction and recovery? And, you know, I could go down the line. You know, the Fairmount commuter rail line, it was started with a conversation about a train, but, you know, quickly moved into one about environmental justice, neighborhood and racial equity. And, you know, with the tuition-free community college, so often, you know, I would go into guidance counselors across the city and we'd have a conversation and I'd say, you know, tell me about what barriers your students are facing. And, you know, things started to pop up that we hadn't even thought of. You know, kids are going to graduate out of the BPS school. They had a free T-Pass. How are they going to afford that? They got a Chromebook from the school, but it's, you know, they have to give it back or it's about to give out. You know, so we started to build in some of those things. So again, you know, I think we live in a very hard time when it comes to access. I think we have to do both. We have to work on the physical things and we have to work on the attitudinal things. And, you know, finally, I'll just add, you know, I think the Boston City Council rightfully has gotten a tremendous reputation for being a diverse body. And, you know, I think Ayanna Pressley obviously got the ball rolling in 2009, and we've started to have conversations about things that the Boston City Council probably never talked about as much as they should, whether it's race or gender or sexual orientation. But, you know, I think for me, the disability community is the largest demographic minority. You know, we make up somewhere between 20 and 25% of the population in our country. And, you know, I'm proud to be a part of this community. You know, I think we do amazing things on a daily basis. We adapt, we adjust, you know, we innovate, we learn how to read with our hands when our eyes stop working the way that they once did. You know, we learn how to travel around the city in a wheelchair when our legs stop working. But there's no doubt about it, we face challenges. You know, in America today, 80% of people with disabilities are unemployed. 2 out of 3 are chronically poor. 6 out of 10 people with disabilities have been victims of sexual violence, and 8 out of 10, more than 8 out of 10 women have. And, you know, a lot of these things were new to me over the last couple of years, and I think they're new to a lot of people. And I think one of the reasons that is there's not a lot of leadership for people with disabilities. So I think we have the potential to make Boston literally the national leader on the city council in terms of our diversity, in terms of the policy, in terms of the discussions we're having. So, you know, John, again, thank you for having me, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Anybody, either feel free to put questions in the chat, raise your hand, or just ask them if you have a question. I'll give a few minutes. If not, I can throw in a question of my own.
Fire away, John. Feel free.
I can ask. I'll ask the one question that I had asked Michelle at the end. So, given all the discussions in this past year around kind of police brutality issues, kind of nationally, one of the things, as noted, one of the best ways to limit police brutality is to simply limit police interactions with people and to reduce the scope of what falls under traditional police departments. What are things that you think that Boston can do in terms of having a less kind of, let's say, like militarized vision of what public safety entails?
Yeah, it's a great question, John. And, I think the first thing, I think about is obviously mental health. I mean, I think we recently saw what happened in Newton, and I think there's a lot of questions as to what happened there. There's an issue, I believe, of body camera, not being used or not being available. But certainly that was a situation, I think, where if a mental health clinician was involved, it could have been a different outcome. And I think that's a tragic thing. I think we, bringing in a social worker into the equation, a mental health clinician, a substance abuse professional, 100%. I think those are all things that are proven to be true. And I think we need to take a long look at what we're doing in Boston and make sure that, those folks are involved, if not, exclusively involved in those interactions. And I think one of the things I want to think a little bit about that doesn't get talked, there's no doubt about that, Black and brown people across the country have felt, victim to police brutality. And, I think we're having a nationwide conversation about that, which I think is really important. Another piece of that, the Ruderman Family Foundation, did a study a few years ago, and, they found that probably about half of people that have died in police custody have a disability. And, so a lot of those people are also people of color. George Floyd had a developmental disability. Sandra Bond was epileptic, and, so on and so forth. So, I think Boston has done a good job in terms of bringing in training on disability, but it's not, this isn't an up and down switch like a flip that you flip. I think it's a dial. So I think you always have to be monitoring it. And, administrations change, commissioners change. So I think for me, making sure, for folks that have, autism or their parents, that, that piece of the training for, police officers may know when somebody is deaf and how to interact with them. So, that's just one other thing, John, that I think I would add, into the conversation.
Great, and I see a question from Kim Vermeer in the chat, noting about how disability rights and awareness is an important issue. And what are some of the other top issues for you as you think about what you would work on in the council and build out your platform?
Yeah, so I mean, we're going to be obviously dealing with COVID and the ramifications of that for a while. So I think you have to start there. But I think for me, a couple of things, and it's really building on the work that I've done. I think we need to continue pushing for jobs in Boston that pay a living wage and provide the benefits that people deserve. I think we need to direct those jobs obviously into neighborhoods, into folks that have been left out of the equation. Certainly Black and brown folks, people with disabilities, I would add. And I think I have some ideas on that, and I've been successful in my time in the Office of Workforce Development. I think housing is right at the top of my list with jobs. I think for me, we really, house is really only as good as its ability to connect you to the things you need in your life. And, that's healthcare, that's schools, that's work, that's parks and green spaces. So, I think an emphasis on thinking systematically about our housing, thinking about how we connect those with MBTA stops, bus stops, so on and so forth, I think is really important, because that also brings in the environmental piece if we can reduce the amount of cars on the road. So, I would say jobs, housing, and, sort of being a voice for people with disabilities are certainly the three things I find myself thinking and talking the most about.
Great, and then I see a question from Jackie.
I was wondering what your thoughts are about, I was thinking about when you were talking, I was thinking about safety and climate change and flood control and all that kind of stuff, and the risks to people with disabilities if there's an emergency, and the heating effect and all the other things related to climate change. How do you see that?
Yeah,
those issues?
Oh, sorry. No, that's a great question. I guess, I think about it in two ways. To your point, I think it poses a real risk in terms of, if there were to be a serious climate event, weather event, in terms of evacuation, there's no doubt about it. That's a deep concern. I think the Disability Commission, does work on that in terms of, monitoring where people live and trying to be, communicative with that. But, I'm sure as Jackie, a lot of the impacts of climate change in terms of, air quality, in terms of so on and so forth, have the potential to lead to, conditions that are under the ADA, whether they be asthma, other pulmonary conditions. So, I think there's those two pieces, right? In terms of if a really serious event would happen, I think there's some deep concerns about how people, navigate that disaster. But then I think there's also, if we don't fix what's going on with our climate, it's going to increase the disability population. No doubt about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? And feel free, if you have one, to just ask them directly or drop them into the chat. Harold, Harold, go. Harold, you're muted.
Harold, I do that once a day.
Harold, is it the same? If it's the question that you had put in the chat before from Michelle? Okay, good. You're unmuted.
Okay, good. Not muted, good. Yeah, I was just sort of curious as to your response to what I consider the conflict of exam schools in any given city, wherein there is seemingly inherent discrimination against those who may come from a more concerned and involved, perhaps academically gifted parents, and they funnel them into the exam schools. And this seems to be at the expense of the overall educational system. To me, every school should be an exam school. And the ideal should be that we raise the quality of every high school in this situation. And I was wondering if I'm just off track on that, or because it's conflicted for me as well, because you want to see, optimal performance, but at the same time, it seems to be at the expense of the quote average school.
No, Harold, I think you framed that quite nicely. And, I think obviously there was a big conversation this fall about what to do as sort of an interim step around exam schools. And, they decided in the midst of the COVID to put a pause on the test. And, I think that was the right thing to do. But it doesn't get at the longer term question. And, I would say quality across the board to me is the top priority. I think that, like, to your point, I think there's a lot of folks who have very serious potential as students, and whether they struggle on that one day because they maybe didn't have the resources to have prep, or maybe there's a disability involved, or whatever the case is. So I would agree with you. I think the focus for me, and I watched some of that and quite a bit of it, and my heart is always with special education students. I think I read 22% of the BPS population, I think, falls under special education. And I think there might even be someone on this call, if I'm thinking correctly. We had a really good conversation right around the time of that, and she said to me that disability didn't really come up all that much in it. So I think the quality across the board is really important. I also have read a lot about what's been done at the Henderson School in Dorchester and the Arts Academy around Fenway Park. And they're really working towards an inclusive model of learning that I really would like to see more broadly adopted to the extent it's possible as well. So Harold, I think we're in agreement on exactly what you said.
Well, thank you, Alex.
Thank you.
Any other questions, either that people want to ask or put in the chat? Going once for questions, going twice. Hearing none, the question I'll ask is, if people want to learn more about your campaign, where should they go?
Yeah, so votealexgray.com is our website, and I can put this in the chat. If you have any questions, always feel free to email us at info@votealexgray.com. We're on Twitter, Facebook. yeah, I mean, I built my career on, listening to people and hearing their stories and taking action on it. And, I hope that this chapter of my, life in this campaign will be a campaign that's built on people and their ideas. Because, I think I've worked in government for a good 8 or 10 years, but, as I've dove into this element, I'm learning about things that I didn't know. And it's because of folks like you. So I thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much. If we get a round of applause.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank
Awesome.
you.